Right Honorable Dr. Denzil Douglas, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Economic Development, International Trade, Investments, Industry and Commerce. Honorable Konris Maynard, Minister of Information, Communications and Technology, Posts, Public Infrastructure, Energy and Utilities and Transport. Senator, the Honorable Dr. Joyelle Clarke, Minister of Sustainable Development, Environment, Climate Action, and Constituency Empowerment. Members of the media, listening and viewing audience, good morning and welcome to this morning's press conference that will focus on the recently concluded working trip that our three ministers before you attended in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. To our in-house guests, we crave your cooperation as we ask that you switch your phones to silent mode. I now invite Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Environment, Ms. Sharon Rattan, to give brief remarks.
Thank you very much. A pleasant good morning to everyone, and thank you to the media houses and representatives who are here to learn about our work that we have undertaken in our recently concluded trip. Pleasant good morning also to my esteemed members at the table, honorable members at the table. In short, our purpose here today is to give an update on our participation at what is known as COP27. Simply, COP means Conference of Parties, 27 means the 27th International Meeting. St. Kitts Nevis has been participating in this conference for many years. My little history research took me back to as far as 1997, when the first set of representatives from St. Kitts Nevis attended COP. There was a little hiatus between that, and from 2004, we had more regular participation in the COP convention. Of course, with the pandemic, we had a little break, and then it restarted in 2021. Now, one of the things we believe at the ministry is that COP27 or COP, whatever number that follows, seems to be an abstract concept for our people. Now, just let me put it into perspective for our listening audience and those who are listening online. Every year, the St. Kitts Nevis government pays our dues, our membership dues, to be part of the United Nations and their related member organizations like the UNFCCC. And because we pay, of course, we are allowed to participate and we benefit from attending some of their meetings. What this organization does is they ensure that each country who are regularly paying members get at least three representatives from the country are paid for. It's like a sponsor trip for them. And this year, our member delegation was 9. And there was a special reason for doing so. However, at this point, I would like to pause to thank the Republic of China on Taiwan for assisting us with the sponsorship for the remaining members of the delegation. And the delegation was made up of the esteemed honorable members at the table, including myself. We also had with us Mr. Derion Edmead, an employee, an officer, the Education Environmental Officer in the Department of Environment. And we also had Ms. Cheryl Jeff as our lead technical negotiator, who has performed this role for many years at COP. In addition, there was an interest to to have a young female exposed to COP27 this year, and also taking into consideration the gender issues that are a part of the whole climate change. And her participation was sponsored jointly by the Republic of China and Taiwan and a Girls Care Foundation, who helped to select the individual. Her name is Cordesia Liebert of Nevis. She's a member of the Girls Care group also. And we also invited a colleague from Nevis who works in the Ministry of Planning and Environment, Mr. Sebastian Annas. So that made up the 9 members. Now, today we would like to share with you the perspectives of the experience of the members. And it was a record for us because it was the first time that we have had 3 members of the government attending COP at the same time. Prior, we have had prime ministers who would go and present the statement, the national statement. And now we have had 3. Based on my experience at COP26 in Scotland, I had held the firm notion that we should include our Minister of Energy. And this year, the person represented is the Honorable Konris Maynard. So today, again, we would share what we found at COP, what was our experience, and how we are going to integrate what we learned in the future of St. Kitts Nevis, particularly as the main goal is for St. Kitts Nevis to become a sustainable small island state. Now, we also would like to let the audience, the listening audience, have an appreciation that environment on its own cannot accomplish this. So issues of sustainability, energy, they are all important. And what we do. So it says the first signal I am going to send as I conclude is that this is an integrated effort. It cannot be accomplished by one ministry. So with all that said, I would invite our Miss Nisha David, our communications officer, to start the ball rolling and allow the ministers to present their perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rattan. I now invite the ministers to give a brief summary of the outcomes, the experience, and the main plans for interministerial cooperation that were derived from the overall agenda of the summit. We will begin with Dr. Clarke and to present your opening statement, and then followed by Minister Maynard and Honorable Dr. Denzil Douglas. Minister Maynard.
Thank you, Ms. David, and many thanks to our media who has joined us today and to those listening online. The main outcomes from COP27 can be summarized into three areas: the results for the loss and damage fund, the 1.5 billion threshold, and the commitments to emissions. And in summary, from the technical aspect that the Ministry of Climate Action, Constituency Empowerment, Climate Action, and Environment was really responsible for, we have had a historic establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund. Simply put, richer countries have accepted, have acknowledged, and have committed to supporting SIDS, small island developing states, and island states, island nations, or poorer countries in addressing issues, developmental issues as a result of climate change. The 1.5 billion threshold, this was a commitment from COP26 in Glasgow. We did not achieve great gains as it relates to the commitment to pay to contribute to the fund. However, AOSIS and CARICOM and all the small island developing states will continue this fight for that 1.5 billion, for that the billion fund. In terms of our emissions, there were no further pledges as it relates to reducing emissions. There was a commitment at COP27 to phasing down the use of fossil fuels, but not phasing out the use of fossil fuels. What does that mean for our 1.5 to stay alive? We aren't very close to that commitment. For 2030 or 2050, there is further action needed at the local level, at the regional level, CARICOM, OECS, AOSIS, at the sub-regional level. And there's also recognition that although we are happy with the outcome of the Loss and Damage Fund, we are not altogether pleased that the richer nations, the global north, has made real commitments to moving the agenda forward for climate action. But that's the technical side. As it relates to the expanded delegation and the partnership with the Ministry of Energy, Water et al., Economic Development and Investment, this was historic for St. Kitts and Nevis. One of the first commitments we had as a Ministry of Sustainable Development, Environment, Climate Action et al. Was partnership with the critical ministries which would push the agenda for climate action and climate responsiveness. And I'm happy to say that Minister Maynard and Senior Minister Douglas were immediately on board and recognized the importance of partnering, not just as one ministry, but as 3 ministries, 4 ministries, because we will have other ministries on board in our climate response agenda. Some of the important issues that we tackled at COP27 because of our pavilion presence was 1, selling St. Kitts and Nevis, 2, investors dealing directly with the international funds that have been established for us to access funds for climate responsiveness, the issues of climate justice. It's important that small island states like St. Kitts and Nevis can make their presence known to larger countries. We can make it very clear that this is our experience as a small island which has not contributed greatly to climate change, but suffers the most. In terms of climate action and youth, we're very pleased that we had a youth-led delegation, our technical negotiations, our pavilion presence, the marketing of St. Kitts and Nevis as a sustainable island state was led by our youth members. And that for St. Kitts and Nevis is historic. And we're going to do this for every single COP going forward. Why? Youth action is critical for climate action and climate responsiveness. Young people will inherit St. Kitts and Nevis. And if they are not part of the conversation and the mobilization and the action, then we would not have the necessary buy-in to ensure that St. Kitts and Nevis becomes climate resilient, climate responsive, and can move towards a sustainable island state. And finally, what does this mean for St. Kitts onwards? We have clear commitments in terms of our interministerial partnerships. We recognize that there are funding agencies available willing to support St. Kitts and Nevis in particular. They need our commitment, and we were able to provide that because of our presence, because of the ministers who were there, who were able to lobby on behalf of their various ministries, and importantly, on behalf of a sustainable small island state agenda for St. Kitts and Nevis. We're going to continue working for the most vulnerable because climate change is primarily about climate justice, whether it's small islands, vulnerable people, elderly, women, or youth. We have to continue our actions for climate responsiveness for St. Kitts and Nevis. Thank you.
Pleasant good morning to all. Pleasant good morning to members of the head table, the Right Honorable Dr. Denzil Douglas, Senator Dr. Joyelle Clarke, PS Sharon Ratton and Chairperson Miss David. It was indeed a pleasure to be part of the delegation that participated at COP27 this year. With over 50,000 delegates who descended on Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, COP27 offered what I term a melting pot of opportunities and contradictions. COP27 offered a seat at the table. And for instance, we all witnessed, the three of us witnessed the signing of the release of funds to the Barbados Water Authority, who had accessed $40 million in GCF funding to aid in the transformation of their water authority. That process took over 2 years to come to fruition and only resulted because Barbados found a seat at the table. COP27 offered for loss and damage, for instance, to be on the agenda after 30 years of small island developing states making or clamoring for this to even be heard. So that is an achievement, but there is still much more to go. COP27 offered a place where continued negotiations can happen for policies such as the 1.5 degrees Celsius to survive. The Honorable Clarke mentioned it. This is really what the scientists have determined, that we need to keep the temperature rise at the mean temperature rise at before we get into the catastrophic nature of climate events. Also, negotiations on becoming carbon neutral or net zero by 2050. COP27 is the place where these discussions happen. COP27 is also a place for opportunities to discuss, as I mentioned, and interact with funding agencies such as the Green Climate Fund or the Global Environment Facility or the Adaptation Fund, whom we were very pleased to have a meeting with for the first time on behalf of St. Kitts and Nevis. And we are now exploring how we can access the funding that is available through this particular fund. COP27 also offered an opportunity to interact with renewable energy companies and stakeholders from across the globe, those who have done it at the biggest scale and the smallest scale, especially in solar and in wind. But there are also contradictions at COP27, such as the reports that we have seen that there was a 25% increase in lobbyists from fossil fuel companies, and the language use of phasing down fossil fuel use instead of phasing out. And the question of what we call the wealthier G20 countries fulfilling what has been termed as the moral responsibility for climate action. As you would know, small island developing states such as ours contribute less than 1% to the greenhouse gas emissions, but we are the most disproportionately affected by climatic events such as hurricanes and floods and droughts and sea level rise, land and forest degradation. Meanwhile, the developed countries, who are responsible for 80% of the total greenhouse gas emissions, do not have that disproportionate effect on their economies and their livelihoods. In fact, SIDS, who contribute less than 1% to greenhouse gas emissions, have to spend in recovery and losses about 20% of their overall spending, whereas the developed nations, such as North America, are spending maybe about 1.2% of their expenditure, and in Europe, even less than 1%. So this is why it was very important for the CARICOM, together with the AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island Developing States, to strongly pursue the issues of loss and damage and similar issues at COP27. As I mentioned, it was an opportunity for us to be engaged at the highest level across the globe. And as the Minister of Energy and Water, I lead a ministry that is at the focal point of what is necessary or needed for us to be renewable and sustainable, or to have a renewable and sustainable future. One of the effects, for instance, with respect to how climate change has affected us, such that it can hit home to persons, over the last 10 years or thereabout, there has been almost a 20% decrease in rainfall in St. Kitts. We depend on rainfall for our water. 70% of our water comes from underground, or what we call groundwater. That comes from the rain, which permeates the soil and goes into our aquifers. With a 20% decrease in rainfall, but a continued increase of access to those aquifers, you can see the challenge of why it is not possible to maintain 24/7 water. And so we are directly affected. And that is why it was important for us to be present at the table to express the challenges that we are having, such that we are able to access the necessary resources and funding to help alleviate this problem. I want to end by expressing tremendous amount of thanks and appreciation to the Republic of China and Taiwan for sponsoring this particular delegation to COP27 and allowing us to be present and to have a seat at the table. And I want to look forward to the interministerial partnerships that will emanate out of these discussions in terms of the establishment, for instance, of the National Energy Task Force, such that we can have a wholesome, a whole of government approach to how we are going to transition from fossil fuels to 100% renewable energy. I will leave it there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Konris, members of the press, my colleagues at the head table, those of us, others in the audience. Let me express how pleased I am to participate in this particular press conference this morning, having been a member not only of the delegation of St. Kitts and Nevis that went on to COP27, but being a member of the government that, since it was placed in office on the 5th of August, has been engaged in several discussions in the Caribbean and globally in order to prepare ourselves and at the same time lend our support to the framing of the agenda that was being debated at our conference in Egypt. In other words, we got into office on the 5th of August of this year. A new government was put in place. It has several ministers of government who were appointed. And since then, each, I believe, had been tasked in preparing himself or herself with information that was critically important to support our position as we debated with persons from all over the world in this very important conference in Egypt. In other words, we have been to the United Nations, we have been to the Organization of American States, we have been to discussions with the European Union in trying to frame what would be our development agenda as we interact with our fellow states from Africa, from the Caribbean, and of course from the Pacific area. I remember, for example, when we were at the United Nations in September, there was a series of side meetings, one of which was with the delegation from Egypt. And that interaction between CARICOM and the delegation from Egypt there at the United Nations included the chairman who was going to be chairing the COP conference in Egypt. And we were making the point as CARICOM leaders that there have to be certain specific topics on the agenda for COP27. What were some of these things? We were saying, for example, that we wanted to impress to the rest of the world that the concept of multidimensional vulnerability index was going to be critical for us to get acceptable or acceptance at the COP27 conference. We were also making the point in those forums that we have attended in framing the agenda that there has to be a coming together of minds with regard to the loss and damage concept or idea that we wanted the rest of the world to accept in order to give us, from small states, a chance to survive in the future. And so I want to say that, in particular, these were two of the important outcomes at COP27. There was an acceptability of the concept of multidimensional vulnerability index. In other words, even though countries like St. Kitts and Nevis were considered to be relatively high income countries, high per capita income countries, even though we had been graduated in the past out of concessionary support from those international financial organizations which were assisting us, even though we were considered to be high-income or middle-income countries, we nevertheless suffered tremendous loss and damage from the climatic conditions which were being caused as a result of environmental disruption caused by those large industrialized countries that were emitting large quantities of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, disturbing the entire environment, and thus contributing to hostile hurricanes that destroyed us down here, our infrastructure and our people's livelihoods on several occasions. So it was really an amazing experience to see the rest of the world converging for at least maybe nearly 2 weeks at a place called Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, just off the Red Sea coast, to debate these very issues that we have been saying for years needed to be brought to the attention of the world so that countries like St. Kitts and Nevis, small island developing states, could really survive and have better livelihoods. The argument, therefore, was that we are people too. They may be small, but we are people. We have a right to exist. We have a right to develop our agriculture so that we can feed ourselves properly. We don't want to be beggars to the rest of the world. Our young people have the right to aspire to the top education that they can receive, using information technology, which we were being deprived of as a result of the hostilities and the continued disruption of our people's livelihoods. We wanted that to change. We believe that our people have the right to cheap energy. Why should we continue to burn oil or diesel to generate electricity at high prices being paid by our consumers? And we can harness the energy from the sun. And we can generate energy from windmills where it is cheaper, where we can have the development of our geothermal energy in Nevis, and not only become consumers of energy that is imported into our country, but become a net exporter of energy to the rest of the islands around us, making life easier for us. COP27 was the place to bring those arguments and to see the world, the industrialized world, react under pressure to the demands of people from small island developing states, those from the Alliance of the Organization of Small Island Developing States, and those who had been told for years that because you have a high per capita income, you cannot get support of financing and funding unless you pay high interest rates. That is what we have been told for years. And we were saying that you can't just simply look at the high per capita income of countries, but look at how vulnerable they are to climate change, which to a large extent was contributed by the industrialized world. And consider this as an important matrix to determine whether a country should receive assistance or not. And so my experience at COP27 was an amazing one. I was at the COP in Copenhagen. I think it was back in 2014. But this was different because people spoke out. People demanded recognition of ideas which for years went along the way, unnoticed. And so I believe that the acceptability of the MVI, the acceptability that there is need for a fund, no longer $1 billion fund, but $1 trillion fund. Not that we are asking that there be reparation, that you pay us for the damage you have caused us over the years, hundreds of years, but that you come and sit at the table with us and recognize that there's something called climate justice, and there's something now called climate action, which is determined to ensure that justice is delivered. That was my experience at COP27. Thank you.
Ministers, Thank you, Honorable Ministers. Kindly note the following guidelines. All questions will be directed to Permanent Secretary Ratan as the most technical person on the team in Sharm el-Sheikh. She will either respond or field your questions to the relevant minister on the panel. Before asking your question, kindly state your name and the media house that you represent, and each representative will be allowed to ask 2 questions at a time to allow for the smooth flow and also to give the ministers adequate time in which to respond. Let me also recognize the media houses and our guests on the virtual platform. If there is a question, please use the raise your hand feature, or you can type your question in the chat box and preface it with the letter Q or the word question. I will acknowledge as many as I can. Before we take questions, I'd like to reintroduce one question that was posed during the Prime Minister's press conference held on November 15th. It was a question intended for Dr. Clarke. However, since she was away on national duty, she will now respond to Kevon Brown from WinFM, who asked, quote, COP27 ends this week and the loss and damage funding seems to be a topic of discussion for COP27, and it is reportedly lacking in substance, that is, loss and damage funding. What are we doing locally or regionally to secure our own loss and damage funding in light of the inaction of wealthier countries since the adoption of the Paris Agreement? As a follow-up question, he asked, quote, while the loss and damage funding made it on the agenda, securing commitment from all richer countries has not been accomplished, and there was fear that the conference would end without it being addressed, although it finally made it on the agenda. What is your response to that?
Thank you, Ms. David, and let me thank Kevon for those questions from last week. I think I'll start with question 2, considering loss and damage did make it on the agenda, and speak to what Senior Minister and Foreign Minister just mentioned about climate responsiveness. About climate responsiveness in terms of a recognition. In terms of a recognition by richer countries, the EU, the UK in particular, and the US, that there is a need for climate responsiveness, and that could only be done through the Loss and Damage Fund. Importantly, AOSIS was one of the biggest lobbyists for the Loss and Damage Fund, and that was chaired by Mr. Malwyn Joseph of Antigua and Barbuda. So AOSIS has been chaired by Antigua and Barbuda for the past year, and the AOSIS, CARICOM, the OECS has spent the entire year lobbying with the EU and the US about establishing the Loss and Damage Fund. And our technical officer, Ms. Cheryl Jeffords, could confirm that it was up until Saturday night, very late, that we finally had some movement on establishing the fund, having official negotiations in terms of how the fund would operate, and a timeline in terms of when we would come back to COP28 with further details on the fund. So we weren't very pleased as a region that it took us into the late hours of a 2-week conference to have that established. But what we do recognize is that there's a lot at play when it comes to, as Foreign Minister mentioned, climate responsiveness and climate reparations. It's a lot of geopolitics. Do you fund small island developing states? Do you include other G77 countries like China, for example, who may be contributing even more to climate emissions because of their heavy reliance on coal. And the short answer to this for Mr. Brown is St. Kitts and Nevis, our very presence at COP27 this year, recognizing that loss and damage was a red line for CARICOM and AOSIS. That was the start of our own action as a country in terms of loss and damage. We committed to supporting the position of CARICOM and AOSIS and the OICS, and we committed to supporting the loss and damage fund globally. What have we done locally? This press conference is one of the outcomes. We have committed as ministers to working together through the Climate Action Unit that has been recently, the ministry that has been recently established by the Labour government to ensure that there's an interministerial agency which can champion loss and damage, which can champion access to the adaptation fund for the Ministry of Water, and the minister will speak more to that, and also which can champion the energy as an economic sector, as well as investments and economic development and private sector partnerships, so that we could de-risk investment in climate responsiveness for St. Kitts and Nevis. Importantly, the SIS agenda that we have, small islands, the Sustainable Small Island State Agenda, is a direct response to our need to ensure that St. Kitts and Nevis either accesses money, either uses our income and revenues rather to put towards climate responsiveness, and ensures that our development policy is a result of our recognition that we must build forward, we must build better, we must ensure that the engineering, the infrastructure, the education, the behavioral change, the investments, the push for tourism, all come under the umbrella of climate responsiveness. And lastly, we have recognized that Caribbean islands such as Antigua and Barbuda have moved forward in terms of accessing the adaptation fund. Barbados brought to COP27 the Bridgetown Agenda, which is making headway and a lot of waves in terms of what Caribbean islands can access if there's a political will, as evidenced by our presence here, to move forward an agenda of climate responsiveness and climate action. By COP28, we will be able to put forward our own St. Kitts Nevis SIS agenda, which will attract funding, investors, and technical support for our critical areas: water, energy, technology, food, and sustainable industries. Thank you.
Excuse me, Ms. David. I'll just add something to what the minister said and relate it to what was asked by the Mr. Brown, is it? Yes, Mr. Brown. One of the things COP did for us, it forced us to reflect on what our status is at this time and discuss and debate vehemently what the level of climate responsiveness that we would want to adapt. And the main discussion for our team was how would interministerial approach look? How would that look? We acknowledge that it certainly cannot look like what we have been doing so far. It has to have a different form. And we are going to be looking forward to establishing that interministerial agency. We don't know how it would look yet, but we know what we want. And we know that we can get the assistance in establishing that body so that it can provide that support. Because I would want the citizens to understand that these are just not talks. We have to put them into action and align them, and not just align them because of a commitment. We have to align them. I want to emphasize this. We have to align them and act for our own survival. This climate thing may sound abstract to some people. It is not. The Honorable Konris Maynard referred to water and not having water for 24/7. We are living in the reality. We have to fight for our survival. So, of course, our interministerial dialogue, not just dialogue, but the actions would look very differently. So let us look forward to embracing the changes that would help us to survive.
Thank you. We will now open the floor for questions as we welcome our first in-house journalist.
Glenn to all, Glenn Bart from SKN Newsline. Having completed the exercise of COP27, and you have made mention this morning of various things which are relevant to going forward, but in terms of the critical priorities over the next maybe 6 months, what would be the actions of your interministerial program to get some of these ideas off the paper into a more active role in going forward? Secondly, with regards to collaboration now with other CARICOM countries or with CARICOM in general, what would be that program in the context of what is likely to happen next year?
This question will be passed to Dr. Clarke, who is very passionate about what she wants to accomplish, and then she can be supported by any other minister on this.
Thank you, PS. I'll speak to question 2 in terms of the collaboration with other countries, and I think Minister Maynard would be better able to reflect on the interministerial agency. We already started our partnership with Antigua and Barbuda in terms of accessing the adaptation fund, and that continued with the meeting that was spearheaded by Minister Maynard, the Minister of Water, at COP27. Barbados is already on board in terms of supporting our sustainable small island state agenda because of their work with the Bridgetown agenda and because of their streamlined access to the Green Climate Fund. They have already agreed to partner, and we're going to be modeling what we do in St. Kitts and Nevis from them, just to be clear in terms of what actually happens. Barbados has a climate resilience program, a roof-to-reef program, and essentially every development, every project, every policy must pass through and be approved or are supported by the Roof to Reef program. And that's a cabinet policy. And one of the things we learned when we spoke to our partners was the importance of political will. Prime Minister Motley is the biggest supporter of a Barbados pathway or journey to climate resilience. Similarly, we have heard the same sentiments from our Prime Minister in terms of the Sustainable Island State Agenda, and we have here ministers and other ministries which will be on board with that. Importantly, our bilateral partnerships and our support and continued partnership with Republic of ROC, Taiwan, means that we're going to get even further. Because of their support, we're able to establish the pavilion. No other Caribbean country had a pavilion. No other Caribbean country. And that meant we had a space where global movers and actors could find St. Kitts and Nevis, could have meetings, could learn about us, and could engage us on the opportunities that are available. So we will continue our partnership to get this done in the 6 to 1 year period with Barbados and Antigua and Barbuda, ROC Taiwan, and critical funds like GCF and the Adaptation Fund.
Thank you. We'll take another journalist from in-house. I recognize. Oh, there was another question. Sorry.
Could you summarize the other part of the question? Right. Mhm. Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Bat. Well, critical for us, as you would know, is our water situation. And so at COP, at every meeting, that was one of the main focuses. How we're going to achieve that with the interministerial partnership is that the Ministry of Environment and Climate Action is here, who is often the main link to the foundation, the funding agencies that should have mentioned, and also the link to our Caribbean counterparts. And so what has to happen is the development of the framework that will allow us to access funding. It doesn't happen overnight, unfortunately. And just the preparation of the framework can take significant amount of time. I remember at COP being in a meeting at the CARICOM pavilion, where I mentioned earlier that they had the signing of the to release the funding to the Barbados Water Authority. And they elaborated that the 2 years it took was a record time in terms of how fast they were able to turn around from concept and developing of the framework to actually have the agreement made. And then a further record they were trying to break once the agreement happened. I think the fastest time funds had been released before then was 35 days after the signing, and they were trying to do it in 33 at COP. So we are not talking about immediate next month, 2 months, 3 months to access the funding that is available. But if we're not present now, then it's always 2 years down the road. And so that is why it's critical for us to be present now and to engage these different agencies. We are thankful that at COP, we're able to sit firsthand with the Adaptation Fund, which is not one that we have any advanced negotiations as yet with. My understanding is that as a country, we have at our disposal possibly $20 million to aid in our adaptation here in St. Kitts as a result of climate change. And a project can be as large as $10 million. I have discussed with my colleagues that our emphasis for this access to this fund must be the transformation of our water sector. And so we are going to use that resource to develop the framework that will allow us to access the funding to assist in our water transformation. So I want to express to the country that we understand the troubles that we have met with respect to our water situation. And if these decisions and these positions were taken only just 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, then we would be at a place like, for instance, Barbados, having access to $40 million in grant to transform, not loans, grants to transform its water sector and to make it resilient. We are behind, but you can be rest assured that this government and our ministry is going to be punching hard to speed up. In fact, I would tell you that after that meeting where you had the GCF signing with the Barbados Water Authority and the head of what is the 5 Cs signing, I personally went and said, St. Kitts and Nevis is going to have to be next. And so we have established the links already, and we are going to be building out the framework so that we can access it. In the meantime, very shortly, I will give a more detailed outline of the situation with water and what we're going to do in the medium term to alleviate some of the challenges that we have.
Ms. David, just to underscore something, being the permanent secretary serving in the ministry and for our citizens to understand is that for these funds, there is a lot of bureaucratic steps that we have to take, what we would term bureaucratic, but we have to meet certain criteria. And I would use this opportunity to alert the technical officers working in the ministries, because they are critical in providing this information in a timely manner. So again, I would like to emphasize that the exercise forced us to look into ourselves to see what improvements we have to make at the level of our ministries to reach to the level of Barbados and to make the timelines that the Honorable Konris Maynard pointed out. We have to work. We have to reorganize, work in the ministries so that we can meet those criteria.
Journalist from in-house.
Good day, Jason Davis of ZIZ Broadcasting Corporation. My questions relate to the Loss and Damage Fund as we've been discussing so far. I know it's still very early, but are there any logistical details that can be shared? For example, who would add to the fund, the process of adding to the fund, and who manages the fund? Secondly, realistically and actionably speaking, how much of a win is this fund considering the larger nations have not shown the level of commitment necessary to help small island developing states?
Well, I will begin first and then open the floor to my colleagues after. It was a win, Mr. Davis, from the point of view that they actually accepted it. If you've followed the history before, this has been at COP, even prior to my participation at COP26. There has been many discussions on whether it even should be considered. This year we got it on the agenda, and this year we got a commitment to establish the fund. We are thankful for that because it has been years. The second thing, yes, we are all curious because the devil is in the details as to how this fund will be shared, how it will be accessed. We don't have that information at this time. So we have a task, we have to continue so that we can benefit. One of the things we have to look at, and one of the arguments I anticipate that will be going forward, and the Honorable Dr. Denzil Douglas referred to it, Caribbean Development Bank is already on board with it and is asking them to look at the countries through the lens of the multi-vulnerability index. That is very hard for them to accept at this time because they focus on GDP. So, but we have to, there's a lot of work we have to continue doing, and we have to thank the Caribbean Development Bank for putting this on the international agenda. For us, CARICOM, AOSIS, but they need to look at it from the lens of the multi-vulnerability index in order for us to benefit from whatever is available in the loss and damage. So everything is relative. It's a big win, but we have much work remains to be done. I don't know if anybody else on the panel would like to respond, Dr. Douglas?
Yeah, I think it's important that we understand that this is the beginning. And what it means is that at every opportunity onward, we must continue to press for this particular fund to be properly established. Some may think that, oh, well, let's give in to it on the early hours of the Sunday morning at the end of the conference. And then, and then we will just simply forget it and it will go away. It will never go away. And we must ensure that it will never, ever go away. I made an oblique reference to reparation because those whose psyches have been affected by the term reparation, those are the ones who are afraid. that we are now getting into the colonial past. We are getting into compensation for damage of the past. So we have to make clear that there is a particular distinction, because reparation is real. But we are not saying that this is part of the reparation exercise. So let us not become distracted with the arguments that will be brought from the other side, that this is the reparation argument. No. It is about loss and damage. It is about how we have been affected as human beings, how our lives have been disrupted, how our women folk are unable to continue their livelihoods every time there is a climatic disruption, because it is as a result of some phenomenon which would have taken place before. And so it is for us, as you know, we are a stand. On either side of me are young people. It is for them to continue this very strong argument in the future, and it will be delivered. Mark my word.
If I may just add to what the minister and the PS would have said, both of us sat in a meeting with CARICOM and members of the UNFCCC, where the sentiment was during the middle of the last week that we will not even get a position on loss and damage, and that we must prepare ourselves to come back at COP28 after coming together in the next 12 months and establishing a framework. If it is that the CARICOM, the AOSIS, Small Island Developing States, had stopped there, then COP27 would not have ended with an acknowledgement from at least our European counterparts that there must be established a loss and damage fund. However, there was regrouping that was done, subsequent meetings that were held, and the issue was pushed further. It was determined by the stakeholders involved that it was insufficient for us to leave COP27 with only having loss and damage mentioned as an agenda item. And so that experience alone gives us the confidence that if we continue to unify our efforts across the small island developing states, the CARICOM, and other stakeholders and friendly countries in very important regions in the world, we can achieve seeing the fund become a reality. And we must get the support as well from the larger country as a whole, not just in St. Kitts and Nevis, but across the region, because this has real impact on everybody's livelihood. As I mentioned, unfortunately, one singular event of catastrophe will set us back decades. And although we might be considered by our GDP to be high or middle income country, we do not possess the capacity to recover. We cannot tell our people in St. Kitts and Nevis to drive north to New York because a storm is hitting in Florida. And so there must be a collective buy-in such that we can have the strength that we need to have when we appear at the negotiation tables to say that this must be a reality, or else you face having the responsibility of watching the obliteration of entire countries and entire livelihoods. So we are confident that with a unified approach, more will be accomplished when it comes to developing and having a functional loss and damage fund for small island developing states. Thank you.
I'd like to add very quickly the list of wins for Mr. Davis at ZIZ. Win number 1, the acknowledgement of loss and damage. It was a 30-year process. So that was the first win. Win number 2, the formal negotiations at COP. As Minister Maynard mentioned, they could have just acknowledged it and nothing. We had formal negotiations. Win number 3, the acknowledgement that there is a need for the fund and that we would move forward with the setting up of the framework and the modalities for the fund. And win number 4, very recently, as confirmed by our technical officer, Ms. Jeffers, there has been a call for nominations, 2 nominations from SIDS for the transitional committee. This is the work that has to be done for the next year leading up to COP28. And win number 5, for years we have complained as small island states that the Green Climate Fund, which St. Kitts has been in the process of accessing funds through readiness programming, and the Adaptation Fund do not address the colonial and historical antecedents and all those problems related to loss and damage and climate change. So that's the biggest win. There's now a streamlined fund dedicated to responding to all the problems we have faced in St. Kitts and Nevis for years, because as smaller islands, we do not contribute to climate change as significantly as richer, larger countries. So those are 5 big wins. And the 6th one, that loss and damage fund was established under the leadership of a Caribbean neighbor, Antigua and Barbuda, through the chairmanship of AOSIS. That's a big win for us in the Caribbean. So we had at least 6 wins, although there is far to go.
I'll add, internationally, it is claimed it was done on African soil. That's an international win.
Okay, we'll take another in-house.
Roy Williams, SKNIS. I know that the ministers have touched on it in snippets, but I would ask it anyway. Why is the climate crisis also a human rights crisis? And the second question related to the first is, what are some of the human rights implications of the decisions that were made at COP27? I know that Minister Dr. Clarke mentioned that there was no commitment made at COP27 towards eradicating totally the use of fossil fuels for the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. However, she said that there was a commitment made to reducing the use of fossil fuels. And on one hand, they're speaking about loss and damage. But if we are going to speak about loss and damage fund and the hurricanes and the other disasters come in less frequently and less deadly, then of course the movement has to be accelerated to remove the fossil fuels that are creating so much problems with global warming. So those first 2 questions, why is the climate crisis also a human rights crisis? And what are some of the human rights implications of the decisions made at COP27?
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Dr. Clarke will respond.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Williams. Very, very excellent questions. I will answer the human rights crisis and your contradiction. And I think Minister Maynard and Minister Douglas can speak to Minister Maynard to the phasing down versus the phasing out from the energy point of view. And our Minister of Foreign Affairs, the additional aspects of the human rights crisis that CARICOM and foreign ministers have to deal with. Now, climate responsiveness and the loss and damage fund is ultimately an issue of justice and climate justice and a recognition that the most vulnerable amongst us, whether it's within St. Kitts and Nevis, the elderly, the disabled, LGBTQ plus population, the transient population, migrants, those persons suffer the most because of their inherent vulnerabilities, whether it's economic displacement, whether it's language barriers, whether it's their educational status, whether it's their assets and their inability to build resilient homes, for example. We always have to recognize the human element in policy decisions like climate change and loss and damage. And that's why ultimately the climate crisis is a matter of humanity and a humanitarian crisis. It's about people. It's not about just the politics and the money, but it's about how do we survive? How do we ensure that the most vulnerable can live and live decent lives? Now, if you take it very local, we drive through Half a Tree to Old Road. We look at the homes being inundated by the ocean. Do people deserve to live like that just because larger nations pump billions of fossil fuels into the atmosphere, which will lead to sea level rise? And does St. Kitts and Nevis deserve to take loans to build a road? Minister Maynard will have to take a loan to build a road and then another loan to address the damage caused by the road because of sea level rise? And should an old woman or a single mother lose a traditional family home because of climate change? And should larger, richer countries do nothing about this problem that they have caused for some elderly person who has done nothing really to contribute to climate change? It's a humanitarian crisis. Additionally, the greatest contradiction for COP, as was mentioned by our PS, the devil is in the details, is the fact that on one end, we have acknowledged the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund to deal with historical problems caused by larger countries, developed nations. But on the other end, we have not committed to phasing out fossil fuel emissions. So we are still creating a problem while trying to address the problem. That's the geopolitics of climate change. I think our foreign minister would be best to speak to the geopolitics. I don't call the wrong names and the wrong countries. But so he will explain to us why our bilateral partnerships with the UK and the US are important, why our relations with China is important, why we understand now as a country the need to veer away from fossil fuels because of Russia's invasion on Ukraine and how this affects St. Kitts and Nevis. So it's all about the people when we sit here and talk about loss and damage and climate change.
Just briefly on the issue of phasing down versus phasing out. The idea is to phase out fossil fuel. That is what the landmark achievement is to be. In fact, I believe that there is the position is to reduce greenhouse gases by 45% by 2030, if I'm not mistaken, and be net zero by 2050. To achieve that, if you take an approach of phasing down, you're then extending those timelines beyond what the international community has come to recognize as being important for our survival. And so it is not heartening to hear the language used as phasing down. I believe at COP there was a proposal to phase out, but it was not passed, if my information is correct. And although there was significant support for it, and the support is growing, it tells us we still need to push very hard on this issue. You would understand that there are a number of things at play. Why there will be, as I mentioned very early in my presentation, that there were 25% more lobbyists for fossil fuel companies at this COP than the last COP. So you must understand that the idea of phase out will not be something that those 25 lobbyists would have been lobbying for. And so those who believe in the phase out approach need to increase their presence as well by more than 25%, just as a comparison, because persons and countries will have their necessary interests based on their particular positions, because they want to be secured with respect to the energy source that they have, right? While not necessarily concerned of the impact it is having, because their impact from the climate change is minimal. But we will continue as part of the CARICOM, as St. Kitts and Nevis by itself, part of the CARICOM and part of the Sustainable Island Developing States, continue to push for phasing out. And we will lead by example. In the Ministry of Energy, one of the things that was commented by some of the regional agencies is the fact that our ministries are now cooperating. They have said to us that they have not seen the level of cooperation between Ministry of Environment and Climate Change with energy, because the Ministry of Energy will largely be focused still on maintaining the status quo, while the Ministry of Climate Action will be going against that. But here in St. Kitts and Nevis, under this new dispensation, we have decided that it is in our interest, and to lead by example, to join our forces together to bring about zero emissions from St. Kitts, although we contribute very little anyway, but to achieve our renewable energy targets. And we can do it long before the stipulated times outlined by the UN. And that is our goal.
My contribution on this is relatively simple. You heard that we had a pavilion when we were at the COP27 conference. What that meant was that we were, I believe, the only country from the Caribbean region that had its own booth where we showcased everything, where we showcased everything Kittitian and Nevisian. People can come, stop by, have a little coffee, a little tea, some pastries, and look at our videos and chat with us and find out how we are coping with the stresses of the climatic changes that are coming our way regularly. I want to thank the Taiwanese for assisting us in establishing this particular pavilion. But one of the things that we did while we were there, we announced that we were going to have a forum. And in that forum, it was a joint and collaborative work with the Taiwanese delegates who were part of us and our own delegates from St. Kitts and Nevis, from the government, who basically indicated how our women folk have been affected and how their rights to live decently as human beings would have been disrupted as a result of the ongoing climatic changes and visitations of hurricanes, and even COVID-19 that we would have suffered over the last few months and years in the past, and how it was important to build resilience and how it was important to adapt accordingly to these real changes that our women folk, head of households, were experiencing, and what the government would have done in the past and what this government continues to do today to ensure that the livelihoods of our people, of our women folk, would have continued. So that is one aspect of demonstrating how important it is that you can link the climate change crisis with the human rights crises that we are experiencing. But more than that, my responsibility was to see how then can we reinforce our relationship with countries that understand, not just Taiwan, but other countries that understand the phenomenon, the challenges that we are facing. And attracted to our booth there in Egypt, we had a visit from one of our friends in the European Union, Ireland, small. But Ireland was one of the first countries, I understand, during the negotiations to have said, let's give some more money to build this fund so that people's lives can be bettered. And on my departure from Egypt, I stopped in Ireland. I had the opportunity to meet with the foreign minister of Ireland and established a specific pathway that we will follow to develop diplomatic relationship with Ireland, which we at the moment don't have. And I mention that because that is what we are going to have to do. There is the consideration of the geopolitics of all of this. Yes, we are engaged in the European Union, most of which are industrialized countries. But at the same time, we have to ensure that the lobbying for our own perspectives, our own climate action, we want to ensure that there is support for what we're doing in going forward. And so it's going to be very critical that we continue to build relationships, strengthen friendships with countries that have pledged to assist us. We were in Barbados a few weeks ago when the European Union outlined its development support programs for the Caribbean, like it would do for the African and the Pacific countries from our colonial relationships. We want to make sure that in the rolling out of those programs, our agenda that we are speaking of today would be realized. And that is what we have to do in moving forward from here onward. We have to strengthen the relationship with partners who are committed to assist us in transforming our country, making our country better to resist the challenges that we will face, ensuring that food is not going to be short here in our country because of the ongoing war in Ukraine and Russia, but we would be building up our own capacity to produce our own food. That we would be able not to have continuing disruptions in the supply of electricity, but that we would develop the capacity to generate our own electricity. And we will sell electricity to countries nearby. Get going with the geothermal in Nevis. Get going with the solar plant we are trying to establish here. That's what we want to do. And we want to encourage countries who are friendly to us to assist us in this regard. Last week, I haven't told you yet, I had a call from the ambassador of Germany, who is in Barbados, serving in Trinidad and Tobago, serving St. Kitts and Nevis, about their support for solar. This is important. So we need to get going with what we're doing. Get it done so that we can have better lives. People over there want to help us. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Douglas. And I extend the same with that comment. We will bring this press conference to a close. And I extend the same warm greetings to one more question. Okay, we'll accept one more question.
Thank you very much, moderator. We mentioned earlier this issue of the multidimensional vulnerability index. I want to know how much resistance small island states are meeting against this concept. I know CARICOM has had numerous meetings on this. What is the level of alliance with other small island regions in the world in adopting this approach and pushing this agenda to the international community who may, like the United States and Europe and so forth, resist this kind of idea? What's the level of cohesion on pushing and promoting this idea?
This is a very important question because it again emphasizes how important it is to be consistent in your messaging. Before I left office in 2014, 2013, I was one from the Caribbean community. I was the leader then, chosen by the Commonwealth of Nations to go to all of the international financial institutions and speak exactly to this very issue, vulnerability index. 2014, 2015, I went with the Commonwealth Secretariat from Washington and New York to the capitals, speaking to the IDB, the World Bank, the IMF, saying to them that this narrow concept of per capita income is not going to take us anywhere as small island states. You can't lock us out of concessionary support for the development of our people and our country because we seem to have a high per capita income compared to other countries around the world. So what you're saying is that you are punishing us because we are doing well as a state. That's ridiculous. So coming back into government 7 years later, it's amazing to see that this is the main topic. We were so advanced in our thinking here in St. Kitts and Nevis. This is the main topic. So we are making grounds. It is now acceptable. But you're right, there are some countries which still frown upon it. But it's good to sit across the table from the Irish foreign minister and say, we accept it. Just 2 weeks ago, right there in Dublin, at the castle at his office. We accept it. So we have to be consistent with our messaging. We have to demand that we be recognized and that we continue to lobby the rest of the world, the industrialized world, with these ideas. When you look at the number of lobbyists who were there for fossil fuel, because it's their livelihoods as well, over 600 lobbyists to ensure that Oil is pumped out of the earth and sent to us here to burn and disrupt the whole environment. More than the number of us who are from the whole Caribbean region. So this is a fight. And then again, as I said before, some people want to twist it into the quirks of history, that we're talking about reparation. No, we're talking about our rights as human beings to live just like them. That's what it is.
Thank you, Dr. Douglas. Before we wrap up, P.S. Ratton will give her final comments.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. I think this session is a start to the dialogue that the ministries would like to keep. Keeping in mind that we have the goal, a sustainable small island state on the horizon for us. And I think it also signals to you, the media community, and to those listening, what it would take. So I hope we would walk away from here with a deeper appreciation of the challenges internationally and the challenges for St. Kitts and Nevis, but also give you an understanding of the commitment and the political will that exists so that we can chart our own future. We are really looking forward to the potential in geothermal energy, in particular to address the high costs of fuel, because we know as citizens, high cost of fuel means high cost of living. We know that we love our cars, but we also, I guess, for behavior changes down the road, we would like you to be driving less, ultimately. So we're a small country. There are places we can walk. So just know that there are going to be many changes in our behavior to live in a sustainable small island state. The second thing I want us to know is that within our ministries and across the government, with this new dispensation, we are going to have different ways of working so that we can make the criteria and we can access the funds that we need to. This is not about just talking, going to a meeting and talking. So there will be more demands made of the civil servants who are responsible so that we can get to our goal. We also acknowledge, Mr. Williams, in particular, your human rights question, that it is a human crisis. We have already experienced COVID-19, showed us the uneven global responses, and we do have the same uneven global responses for climate change. And this affects our society in many ways. It has deepened pre-existing inequalities, especially for women, children. Remember that we have a lot of interest in the tourist industry. Many women work in the tourist industry. Of course, men too, but the stats show that there are many women, more women working in the hospitality in particular, and a lot of them are single parents. So when we have a climate disruption, lots of jobs are lost, families are disrupted, life becomes hard. So these are all the lenses we have to look at the development of our policies, our work plans, and what will happen. And I just want persons to take note of that. And you can look forward to more from this ministry to sensitize persons. And in discussion with the minister, this is why this was so important, to start that conversation with our citizenry so that they can understand. Because people still think, what climate are you talking about? But we are feeling it. The Honorable Konris Maynard, I have to reiterate, we are feeling it with the water problem. When people speak out, they don't know that the rainfall has been reduced by 20% in the last 10 years, is it? In the last 10 years. That's because it's getting hotter. The droughts, And we always boast in saying it's about how we have water, but we're having less rainfall. So we have to address the transformation of our water services, how we access it and how we use it. So we want to thank you very much for this. And also we wanted to share with you, it was a very historic COP for us. The first time we have had 3 ministers being represented. And also whilst there with Minister Dr. Douglas, we coined climate change and diplomacy. So he now has that new responsibility under his belt. And it was the first time we had a pavilion. Let me tell you, I did not. Yes, I left here saying, yes, we're going to have a pavilion. But to be on site and see the people coming to make appointments to see Minister Douglas, I don't know word got out, he would be there. And we had appointments lined up for him before his arrival. And we also were able, to promote our Calypsonian minister, Minister Maynard, because we felt that his lyrics on the one song was very appropriate to the motto for COP, which is Together We Can. So we had our own forum. We invited many countries that came, and he sang the one song. It was a raving occasion. We even had a quiz, and one woman shouted, she had her passport in her hand, a citizen, I think she's a CBI citizen. I'm a Kitishan. She won one of the quizzes. So it really, the pavilion task, let's warn, it is expensive. And we are very thankful for the sponsorship of the Republic of China on Taiwan. So with all of that, we will continue to break down the concept of climate change for our citizens so that they can understand the total impact it has on our lives. Thank you so much for coming and joining us. And we hope those of you online, we didn't get any questions from you, but we hope that you would stay abreast. Thank you.
Thank you, P.S. Rattan, and I extend the same warm thanks to you, Dr. Clarke, to Dr. Douglas, and also to you, Minister Maynard, for being so obliging. Thank you, friends in the media, for your questions. Thank you, listening and viewing audience, for your keen attention. As the now trending tagline for this administration goes, we are working. Signing off from Bastille, good afternoon.